Hi everyone, my name is Madi Marquez and I am the Director of Administration for EricsHouse. EricsHouse is a nonprofit organization who helps those who have been impacted by suicide, substance, or sudden loss. Today we have a very special guest here at EricsHouse. We have Greg Eckerman, who is a co-founder of EricsHouse. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you, Marty.
So Greg is going to tell us a little bit about A Guy's Grief. He's currently the leader of the group support here at EricsHouse for the men's group. So again, I want to commend you, Greg, for helping us today to understand a little bit more about how men grieve. I know this is your particular journey, and so let's go ahead and get started.
Okay.
Just to tell you a little bit about Greg, Greg Eckerman is an aerospace engineer and practicing Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt, consulting for medium and large companies in a wide variety of industries worldwide. He is also a father of two intelligent, independent, capable young women and stepfather of three sons, including Eric. So I know you are the co-founder of EricsHouse and Marianne's husband. So can we start off with how you and Marianne met?
So we met when we were both working at Allied Signal and got assigned to work on a project together by a guy who was my boss at the time and Marianne's former boss. And I don't think things clicked nearly as quickly for Marianne as they did for me. So it was a bit of an uphill battle for her to kind of buy into the idea that it might be a good idea for the two of us to get together. But fortunately, that all worked out. So as you mentioned, I have two daughters and was divorced about 5 years at the time that Marianne and I met. And, while I was aware that there were challenges in being a step parent. I grossly underestimated them, but I really bought into the idea that it would be wonderful to have sons, and that would be a nice kind of addition to my family, and so that was for me always a bonus in the relationship with Marianne.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's beautiful, Greg. And how long have you been married?
It'll be 22 years in October. Beautiful. So I first met the boys, including Eric, a year before we were married. So at that time, Eric would have been 9, or maybe just before he turned 9. And so, it was, and, it's a great age. Kids are awesome at that age. And my daughters are about the same age. So my oldest, Erin, is the oldest of the 5, but only by a year. And then there's Rob, my oldest son, or stepson, Joey, and Alexis, my younger daughter, were born in the same year, and then Eric was 2 years after that. 8888, as a matter of fact, for Eric. Wow. Which is a number combination you'll see used frequently throughout EricsHouse.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, that's a beautiful story, and you both became a blended family. So what type of dreams and aspirations did you have as a family?
So I was at a stage in my career where I was transitioning. I mentioned that Marianne and I were both working at Allied Signal when we met. Shortly after that, in fact, not long after we were married, I started my consulting career. So kind of left the corporate world and started trying to sell my services to the corporate world. So from a family perspective, I always had this vision of who I would be as a father and how I would relate to my children. And, it was always so much easier in my mind and so much more beneficial for everybody involved. And none of those challenges really raised themselves at that point until I got to reality, and then reality kind of smacked me in the face. So our dreams were around really pulling our, making sure that our kids were an active part of our lives and doing things together. But we were also both at a stage where, we were pretty intensely committed to our careers. And that, honestly, as I look back, sometimes I wonder if maybe that wasn't too much of a priority in my case. It's one of the things I struggle with, honestly. But I love what I do. For those that aren't familiar with the terminology Lean Six Sigma or the idea of a master black belt, it's really pretty simple. It's a problem-solving methodology that's got a strong basis in statistics and really focused on business processes. And so, I've been doing it now for 20 years, more actually, probably 25 if you include the latter years at Allied Signal. And, I've seen a lot of the ways that you engage people and see how people struggle when they're confronted with something that doesn't work in their business life. And as I get older, I see how much of that carries over into the way people face challenges in their personal life.
Right.
So that's been an interesting aspect of this. So I don't know that there's any specific big dream that we had for what our family would become or how we would be as a family, aside from, my wish to be a great father and thinking that that was going to be a whole lot easier and more natural than it turned out to be.
It never is, Greg. It never is. So,
Yeah, but I still have my moments. So.
oh, I bet. I bet. And thank you so much for sharing your history about how you and Marianne met and about your family. And I want to talk a little bit about Eric and his injury and his drug use, which led him to his addiction. Can you tell us a little bit more about Eric?
Sure. So one of my earliest memories of Eric was when Marianne and I were first dating. And, I'm a moderately big guy. And Eric is this, 9-year-old kid, and he's just like all energy and, everything was just spectacular for Eric. Nothing could just be normally like fun. It just had to be over the top. So one of my favorite memories of him is when I would walk into the house, he'd be in the living room climbing on the furniture, because who would bother to sit on furniture? And he would just fling himself across the room and, land on my back. And, it was just kind of cool. It was, for me, that kind of epitomized, what I'd like to have in a relationship with a son. Because, my daughters were never that physical. And it was just, it's a great memory for me. And that's the way Eric was. He was very high energy. He was kind of a daredevil. Loved to do skateboarding and jump his bike over mounds that they would build out in the desert, and everything just had to be, it's like he would jump his bike over a mound, and he got 30 feet of air, in his mind. And that's the way the story had to be for him. And at the same time, I'm pretty sure we had more visits to the emergency room with Eric than all the other kids combined, probably by a factor of 2. So, there was always something, he was bulletproof in his own mind, probably probably kind of like I'm, this spectacular father in my own mind, but he was bulletproof in his own mind. But the reality was not quite that way. It was like we had they would know us by name in the emergency room.
Wow.
And so related to that, Eric and Rob both got involved in wrestling in high school, and I was a wrestler when I was in high school. And so I don't know how much that played into that, but they were both pretty intensely committed to doing it and did very well. Both of them did really well, went to state. But Eric injured his wrist, his on his right hand, pretty badly, and went through a series of surgeries. I think 7 surgeries all told.
Wow.
And each seemed to make things just a little worse. It's just like more and more scar tissue building up. And so this started towards the end of his junior year in high school, and then transitioned well beyond that. So by the time the last probably 5 surgeries, he was 18, an adult, and there's there are HIPAA laws require that a lot of that information is not shared with anybody but the patient. And so we later found out that he, in addition to the surgeries, he also wound up with a lot of doctors who were writing him prescriptions for prescription opioids, painkillers, and ultimately those proved to be inadequate. He found a source, tried heroin. I think at first that probably gave him relief that he wasn't getting from the prescription opioids. And, like so many stories like this, it turned into a full-blown addiction. But through all of that, Eric was always very charming. I mean, he truly, he'd walk into a room and, wind up just kind of being the center of attention. And at the same time, he was really a loving kid. He would, our middle son, Joey, is Down syndrome. And one of Marianne's sisters was Down syndrome, Anne Marie. And, Eric just had a special bond with both of them and looked out for both of them. And God help anybody that, made fun of them or, disrespected them in any way, if Eric was around. That was just, that's just the way he was. And he was always kind of looking out for the underdog. And he was that way through his whole life. And, so for me, the addiction part of Eric's life is not who he was. It's just kind of a footnote and an unfortunate end. And I know it caused him a great deal of guilt and remorse and shame. And ultimately, he just decided that the best thing for him to do was to leave us. And I think it was, a momentary kind of lapse. Things just overwhelmed him in a moment, and that's all there was. And so for me, it was also part of the challenge. As a stepfather, as I think I'll generalize a little bit. I usually try to avoid that, but I think for most step parents, there are barriers sort of built into the relationship. I mean, it's, I knew early on it would be a mistake to try to push myself into the role of father. I'm not your father. I'm your stepfather. You have a father, and I hope you have a good relationship with him. But there's always, there's an additional layer of challenge in all of that. But I had Eric for 17 years, so he's my son as far as I'm concerned. So when we lost him, that week was kind of a tough week. Marianne and I were both working and we were traveling, and Eric was really struggling at that point. He'd gone through several rounds of rehab, and actually done really well. Had, extended periods, better part of a year sober, clean and sober, and really kind of doing well, going to ASU and working on a degree and working at the same time. And, it, it really gave us a lot of hope. And then things kind of came crashing down for him a few months before he took his life. And Marianne and I were traveling. It was one of the very few times, aside from when we had a business together in Mexico, one of the very few times that we worked together while I was consulting. And Marianne had been in touch with Eric, and she was, their relationship was remarkable. I won't go into great depth there, but there was a very special bond between Marianne and Eric. And we knew he was struggling that week, and we got home on a Friday, and Marianne talked to him that evening and made a date to meet him for breakfast the following morning. And meantime, Joey had his best friend over, and they were doing what they normally do, which mostly involves watching movies and talking a lot. But he stayed over, and in the morning I stayed with the boys, and Marianne went down to get Eric. And so, this is one of those moments that is sort of indelibly etched in my mind. The next morning Marianne had left, and I was going to take the boys out to get them. It was late enough. I think I was going to take them for hamburgers, but it was a little bit early for that, but never too early for Joey to get a hamburger.
Right.
And we were driving there, and Marianne called, and when I answered the phone, all she said was, "He's dead." But it was just a wail. And that's, that was the moment, that's, I think a lot of us have these moments where in that instant, your life will never be the same again. That's something that you can't just assimilate into the way your life was. That you don't know what it means at that moment. You don't know how deep the changes go, but you know that a lot of the preconceptions and a lot of the priorities you had up until that moment are irrelevant. And so that's that day. I won't go into that day. It was one of the most horrible days in my life. But we got through it. I was able to hand the boys off to make sure that they were okay, Joey and his friend, and I went to be with Marianne, and our oldest son Rob was there by then, and it's just a terrible time. And so, pardon me?
No, I said definitely, and it sounds like Eric was a wonderful young man, and it's such a terrible tragedy. But can you tell us a little bit about, not only did you lose your stepson, right? You're experiencing that grief, but you're also needing to kind of step in, right? And try to help your wife grieve, your children, your other stepchildren. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So that first year, well, I would say, especially the first 9 months, I don't remember much of, to be honest. I sort of took on this mantle of, at least in my mind, protecting Marianne, because I could appreciate how devastating that loss was. Those of us that have lost a loved one know that sometimes the rest of the world doesn't necessarily know how to approach you, and maybe with the best of intentions says, very hurtful things, and or things that drag you back into the depths of your grief. And it was a really tough time for both of us. I think a lot of days Marianne was just crippled by grief, just unable to function. And so in my mind, I sort of made it my mission to just, take care of day-to-day things. And that included, doing my job because, all the obligations stay around. But at the heart of it, I think I was also trying not to have to face my own grief. And I didn't realize that for a long time. I felt like I was, doing everything I could to support Marianne, and not recognizing that, a lot of what I was doing is sort of typical masculine behaviors with regard to grief. And so one of the reasons I chose the title One Guy's Grief Journey, or whatever it is, but the one guy, is that, I'm really cognizant of the fact that everybody's journey through this kind of grief, losing a loved one, is unique. And there are some stereotypical aspects of what I label a masculine approach to grief that are just kind of, those stereotypes exist for a reason, because a lot of men do that.
Right.
But some women grieve the same way. We have cultural pressures to kind of move on. Aren't you over that yet? Haven't it's time to put this behind you and get to the next step. And I think maybe men are just a little more susceptible to that. I've read a lot about it subsequently, and it's a very interesting topic. I think many of us have experienced the fact and have said men grieve differently, and it's true for most men, not all. But there's something about that masculine approach to grief that doesn't feel entirely compatible with a feminine approach, which tends to be much more focused on outreach. Find the connections, spill your guts, look for support, ask for help, and those are things that we don't necessarily encourage men to do, and that many of us aren't very good at. For us, it kind of came to a head. There's another moment I think I will never forget. About 6 months in, Marianne was having a very tough day, and she looked at me and said, "Do you even miss Eric?" And for me, that was like, oh my God, what have I done? I picture that I'm doing this to care for my wife, whom I love dearly, and yet she feels like I've abandoned her and abandoned our son. And that, so that was kind of a turning point for me. And I'm thankful every day that I had somebody in my life who was willing to take a look at me and say, I know you think you're doing okay, but you're not. In fact, you're not doing anything about dealing with your grief. And maybe it's time you took a look at that. And it really has helped me a lot. At the late in that first year, 2016, Marianne went to a retreat in Boston that she had found that was for grieving parents. And that was another turning point for us. And she came back from that saying, we have to do something like this. It took a while. It took a year before we sponsored our first Emmaus retreat for grieving parents. And that, I was so far out of my element. I mean, I'm with this group of people that's, anytime you lose a child, I think there's deep trauma that's associated with that. And there's it's wrong on so many levels. It's not the natural order of things. And so here I am, and I was very much in an ancillary role. Marianne was kind of running the show, and we were supported by the people that had founded the Emmaus organization. And still I'm just feel like I have no clue what to do with this. But it sort of naturally broke out that of course in every grief scenario that I've been involved in, you get a much smaller portion of men than women who are actually doing something about their grief, which says volumes. But I wound up with the subset of that group that was men, and that turned on some lights for me, because we were in a group, and the first 15 minutes nobody's saying anything of consequence. We're doing what guys do. You make jokes about something, except jokes are horribly inappropriate in a scenario like
right.
this where you're talking about grief.
Right.
And ultimately we kind of broke through, and I finally figured out, well, I guess this is my role. I can model that. I can just kind of put it out there and put out how horribly I feel and how much I miss Eric, and the dam just kind of broke. And we had guys saying, predicating their statements with, I've never even said this out loud before.
Wow.
So it was powerful, and it convinced me that it wasn't just me, that there's a need to support those of us who exhibit this masculine grief tendency.
Right.
And also something I've come to believe even more deeply since, when we talk about how men grieve, and we do it, in community, there's a tendency to kind of position that as a bad thing. And it's not a bad thing. It's just a thing. It's how some of us are. And if you look over the history of humanity, there's good reason for it. Because if you're an Aboriginal tribe somewhere, there's still a tiger out there looking to eat you. Somebody's got to keep the wheels on the tracks, and
right.
Find the next meal and do, and so a lot of different cultures have very similar sort of dichotomy of roles. Women grieve this way and are typically the active mourners, and the men, tend to take a longer range view, and short term they're focused on keeping everybody fed and alive, and longer term they're thinking about what they're going to build in memoriam to the person that they lost. Right. And there's a place for both, and there's I think it would be a real disservice if when you encounter somebody who's engaging in that masculine grief, they shouldn't be criticized. There's nothing really wrong with it, unless they don't ever create the opportunity to open up and explore and look inside themselves. And so it's kind of led those Emmaus experiences and feedback that I consistently got from the guys that I was working with, led us to set up the men's group for EricsHouse.
So I do want to ask, Greg, I'm sorry for interrupting, but you mentioned that at the beginning you avoided your grief, right? And you delved into your work. Do you feel that when men, particularly, right, avoid their grief, does it tend to release in some other type of form or way, or in anger of some sort? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I again, I'm always hesitant to generalize too much, right. But I think so, yeah. I mean, I think, initially, for me, I threw myself into work because I knew how to do that. I didn't know how to grieve. And I didn't know, what the boundaries were, how, what the limits were, what was okay for me and what wasn't. And, I had had plenty of loss in my life before that, both my parents and two sisters. Um, but this is different. For me, this was different. And so, yeah, I think that there is a tendency to kind of suppress a lot of those feelings, and you can only avoid that for so long. Eventually you're going to have to face up to that. And so that, in my mind, that's the downside, the negative aspect of this masculine approach to grieving is you get too long at it, you get too good at putting it off, and then it erupts in other ways. I don't know that it ever manifested as anger for me, but I could certainly see how that would be because, anytime you've shut off a portion of yourself, it's, it's not going to feel right. And that pressure is going to build up over time. But what it did, for me, the negative aspect of it was it sort of created an artificial distance between Marianne and I, and that was the last thing I needed. I'm sure it was, pretty low on her list of needs too. I don't think it was good for either one of us.
Right.
And these kinds of losses are really, or can be really hard on relationships. And I can't take much credit for us moving beyond that. I give it all to Marianne because she called me on it. Hey,
Right.
this, what you think what you're doing, what you think is working is not working. It's not working for you, and it's not working for me. And so, it sort of forced that reassessment. And I think, ultimately, our relationship became a lot stronger because of it. And
Right.
so, and that included, creation of EricsHouse because, you know, based on, especially on Marianne's journey, because she's investigated a lot more of the modalities of dealing with this kind of grief than I have or had. We sort of that gave us a framework for EricsHouse. What worked for her, and what was the kind of support that was just too hard to find out there. And our presumption was there's a lot of people in the same boat, and we've got to find ways to reach out for them or to them. I still struggle with how we effectively reach out to men who are grieving. So I'm going to make up some statistics, which is not something that somebody who does what I do for a living is ever supposed to do. But just
Right.
based on my observations, I assume there's as many men grieving as women, right? I mean,
Mhm.
there
How could they
on
not,
the
right?
average, yeah, there are so many, there are so many tragic losses out there, and they've got each of them on the average is going to affect as many men as women. And yet, when I look, at the retreats that we've done, and opportunities to engage with men, it's about a 5-to-1 difference. There's
Uh,
about 5 times as many women actively doing something about their grief as men. And again, it's not, I can't substantiate that, but that's just a casual observation.
right.
And of those, if that 20%, probably 80% of that 20%, so all but two, let's say, if you start with a population of 100 men who are grieving some significant loss, maybe 20 of them get some sort of help. Of that total population, maybe two of them initiated the search, went out and actively asked for help and
Wow.
found the resources. And so I think first, I'm not in that very small population. I was in the bigger population that obviously had somebody like Marianne to say, give me that shove and say, you really, this is not going to take care of itself.
Right.
You're not, it's not just going to evaporate into the ether. Really, it's work. And
You have to do something
there are
about it.
things that you can do. Exactly. And there are things that work, that, there are effective ways to deal with this. So it sort of convinced me that, you know, you know, one of the best hopes we have is that we, you know, reach out to the people that are in relationship with those men who are sort of denying the need to do anything about it, but yet are candidates, and see if we can't bump those stats up a little bit.
Right.
Because without the push, we've only got 2%. With some push, we're only up to 20%. And, you know, this is a heavy burden. You know, everybody needs a hand.
Right. And it can eventually manifest or erupt in some other way, right? Like we talked about. So I do want to ask you, what are the greatest challenges you face now that it's been almost, well, you're in your fourth year since Eric died. So can you tell us a little bit some of those challenges?
So I am at a place where I don't worry about Eric too much. I'm pretty sure he's doing great and doing good stuff. The big challenge I have is really trying to understand on a personal level what my purpose is. You know, we have this conversation in our men's group and in the retreats all the time. You know, it's like that, like, as I mentioned earlier, there was that moment and I knew nothing was ever going to be the same. Well, it is absolutely true. And I've come to believe that I will never again be the guy I was the day before that happened.
Right, to your loss, correct.
And that's part of what you mourn, right? It's that loss, and you mourn. You know, Eric was a big part of my life, and you know, and I've gotten to the point where I'm much more comfortable being honest with that, because there are things I loved about Eric, and there were things that he did that just drove me up a wall. And now I would give anything to have him come back and, you know, find my tools spread all over the yard, or, you know, something that used to be an irritant. I would love to have that again. But I think that part of the fulfillment that's open to me, the purpose, if you will, is to find some sort of answer, try to crack the code to find a more effective way to reach out to men who are grieving, or let me follow my own advice, to people who are grieving in that masculine way. Right. And I say that, you know, we have a friend who's a woman who lost her husband. She's probably the most masculine griever I've ever encountered. You know, it goes that way. And I've encountered some very few men who are fortunate enough to be able to tap into their feminine side and you know, access some of those, the feminine approaches to grief. So I'm really sincere when I say it. I don't see it as a men grieving, women grieving kind of thing, except statistically it really is. You know, it's, you know, those stereotypes exist for a reason, and a lot of guys are in the same boat that I am. I just, you know, I'd like to find that as part of the answer. I'll never be that guy I was the day before it happened again, and that's not all bad. I mean, you know, I think you get to a point. For me, part of the journey has been to recognize when I'm really deep in that grief, it's a very accurate measure of the quality of the love that's not lost. It's just different. I mean, the love that was before, and you know, that's a good thing. You know, it hurts. It still hurts, Absolutely. But you can kind of get to the point where you savor that and recognize that it's just a reflection of something that you had in your life that was really good. And I don't know, I'd like to find some ways to share those perceptions, maybe just get better at understanding how masculine grievers progress through their grief, because I think that's different too. I think feminine grievers tend to be more comfortable kind of looking at this as a long journey, and masculine grievers are kind of working to make it move beyond it still. I mean, it's always sort of embedded in that approach. And again, I don't know that that's all bad, as long as you're, really getting to the heart of the matter and you're moving through that.
Right. Right. Well, that's great that you want to go ahead and help, the men that are out there who have been through horrific losses and do sometimes need that little push, to help them in their grief journey. So, can you tell us a little bit about what you specifically have done to help you in your grief journey?
You know, um, the most effective things I've done have always tied back to sitting in a small group of men, and just being able to kind of put it out there. It's one of the things I love the most about the EricsHouse model. Um, it's so sort of centered on peer support. Finding somebody who can relate to your grief, and just being able to talk, and not necessarily looking for answers. I mean, in our men's group, I think we all realized pretty early on, it's not our job to fix anybody who's there. It's not none of us likely have the whole answer for anybody. We might have some ideas and we might share them, but just to create that space where you can be vulnerable, and you can open up about your feelings and your grief, and about the journey, because it's not a linear journey. We're not always getting more hopeful and healthier every day. Sometimes you take big steps backwards, and I think of it more as a spiral, and eventually you wind up in a better place. And I feel that way. I feel that we're getting there. We're 4 years out now, almost 4.5, and there are still rough days, and there should be. And I've kind of learned to welcome them, and then be glad when they're behind me. But I think, at the same time, you sort of develop an arsenal of ways to deal with those feelings when they resurface. So you remember the last time you got through it, and what worked then. And so back to your question, the most helpful thing for me has just been having guys that I trust and love and can just open up with.
Yeah, talk about it.
Yeah.
So, thank you for that, Greg. I know that you lead the men's group at EricsHouse. Can you tell us more about your transformation and how you are turning your loss into good?
Well, I actually don't feel so much like a leader of that group as just sort of a facilitator. Um, I try to keep the conversation moving, and I try to make sure that everybody in the group um, has the floor, is active, is opening up and talking, because when you get somebody who's too quiet, they're probably really wrestling with something tough. And and that's about it. I mean, we have a lot of the approaches that we advocate through EricsHouse are centered on methodology that was developed by Dr. Alan Wolfeld. And so for instance, the last 2 or 3 months, we've been working through his 6 needs of mourners. And that's just kind of opened up some fascinating conversations, I think, within the group, and some of the best meetings that we've had. But I'm still learning. I am not professionally trained in this, and so I muddle through probably as much as anything. But I among the things I'm learning or starting to frame are, what is what's different in the journey for a masculine griever, because it seems like it's shorter. It seems like there's a need to kind of bring things to a head more quickly, and then come up with concrete action, and then and so sometimes we'll have men who kind of come and go from the group, and that's okay. I'm all right with that, and I've told everybody, hey, if as long as one other person shows up, I'm good. I get something out of it. So
Right.
so I'm good with having it. But it's really become a very cohesive group, and I don't I I don't think I can take much credit for that. I think it's just sort of what was needed and the way we all support one another.
Well, thank you for that, Greg. And can you tell our viewers when and where are the men's group facilitated at?
So because since the COVID-19 pandemic hit, for the last few months, we've been doing virtual meetings on Zoom like this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually a great platform. It's worked out really well. One of the unexpected benefits was we were able to pull in um, one of the early members of our men's group who moved to Georgia, and so we were able to kind of reconnect, and I love that about this, and I'd like to see more. In fact, our last session was last Thursday. We meet every 2 weeks. That one was our first in months where we had some of us met face to face here at EricsHouse, and at the same time we had a Zoom meeting. So I think that's how we envision going forward. We meet every 2 weeks on Thursday evenings. I believe it's on the events calendar. It's on the EricsHouse website. It's the same night that the women's group meets. So, we kind of hope that at least that opens a possibility of couples, each getting what they need in a group setting at the same time. And I love the Zoom format. I think it's a very appropriate thing for us to continue. So my plan is even when we're mostly meeting face to face here, that that we'll have some guys on the Zoom.
That would be great. That would be great. So, well, I want to thank you so much for sharing your story today and your journey, Greg. Do you have any final thoughts for our viewers?
Just the one, just sort of a call to action. If there's somebody in your life, probably a guy, but a masculine griever that you think has kept their head in the sand long enough,
Right.
give them a little push. We think we're better at hiding this than we really are, and so there's usually somebody who loves that griever, who can recognize that it's time to reach out and time to take action, and it doesn't have to be done in an overly controlling kind of way. It's really a loving kind of gentle nudge in the right direction. But I thank God I got that in my life, and I know most of the guys in the group would echo that sentiment. It's a very kind and loving act.
Perfect.